Welcome to this case study about the city of Glasgow. I'll be talking about its history as a city, about the effects of dispersal policy and immigration, and also going through migrant solidarity and resistance. Best known for its proud shipbuilding past, Glasgow is a post-industrial city that is struggling to come to grips with the impacts of deindustrialisation. Locating the city historically from the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, Glasgow as a workhouse became the second city of empire, a crucial cog in the machinery of producing and sustaining empire. The city's merchants became wealthy from cotton and tobacco production in America, inevitably built on slavery and land dispossession, and the markers of empire can be seen throughout the city. And when we talk about the famous Red Clydeside that Glasgow became known for during the 19th and 20th century, this was when political radicalism amongst the working classes was at its peak of organisation. Rent strikes, labour movements and anti-war activity characterised the political character and energy of the city at this time. Mary Barber was a key figure here, a Scottish political activist, local councillor and magistrate. She was closely associated with the Red Clydeside movement in the early 20th century, and especially for her role as the main organiser of the Women of Govan, who led the rent strikes in 1915. Arguably, Glasgow's story is one of solidarity, of do-it-yourself activism, of community and adversity. This historical context and these moments are often evoked and sometimes take on mythical qualities in the telling and retelling of the story of the city. It is important, of course, to distinguish between these and the stories we would rather not tell. Glasgow is also a city with a history of violence and sectarianism, poverty and ill health. As well as being the city that renamed the square housing the South African Embassy in Glasgow to Nelson Mandela Place during the apartheid era, the city profited greatly from the slave trade. It is a city with a long history of migration, of welcoming Polish migrants during World War II, but also of anti-Irish racism. It is a city where Firsat Dag, a Turkish asylum seeker, was murdered in 2001 in a racist attack. Glaswegians often note that we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, expressing egalitarian sentiments, but racism is as much part of Glasgow's past as its present. As Zandra Yeaman and Lou Deere explore and explain in this blog about the 1919 race riots that went unmarked in the 2019 centenary celebration of the Battle of George Square, a story very closely linked to empire and racism. Glasgow is a city that has undergone rapid urban change in the last 50 years, and migration into the city is a part of that story, particularly in relation to asylum and refugee migration in the past 20 years. But before we can explore the experiences of people in the asylum process who are dispersed to Glasgow, we need to think briefly about the immigration legislation context in the UK, and specifically about the policy of dispersal and its effects. Immigration policy in Scotland is determined by Westminster, so it is a reserved matter. Nonetheless, successive Scottish administrations have attempted to provide more humane responses to refugee movement, including a commitment to integration from day one of arrival. However, because immigration is a reserved matter for the UK government, that is Westminster, the hostile environment and the hierarchies of deservingness cast a long shadow over Scotland and Glasgow's solidarity with asylum seekers and refugees. In the UK, dispersal as a mechanism of immigration management has always been a feature of immigration legislation, particularly in the resettlement of refugees through quota regimes. However, dispersal as a central migration tool was enshrined in the 1999 Immigration Asylum Act. People in the UK asylum system are subject to dispersal around the UK in order to receive government support. The legislative intention was that the distribution across the country of no one area would be overburdened by the obligation of supporting asylum seekers. Under Section 95 of the Immigration Asylum Act 1999, asylum seekers can apply for support while waiting for their claim or appeal to be considered. Support can be for accommodation and/or subsistence according to their circumstances and on condition that they satisfy a destitution test. if provided accommodation is offered in a dispersal area, that is, away from London and the South East, on a no-choice basis. And thinking about dispersal in Glasgow specifically, there's been a twofold rationale behind dispersal: to relieve pressure, particularly in housing, and spread the burden, and also part of a logic of asylum governance which argues that fast and firm processing claims mean no need for existing social ties. Dispersal, when it was first introduced, and since, has created a new social geography in dispersal areas, with the settlement of a high numbers of people arriving from countries with a weak, if any, settlement history in the UK, in predominantly socio-economically poor housing estates. At the time of dispersal, when it was first introduced, this raised concerns over so-called cultural compatibility and fears of parallel lives, despite a lack of evidence to support this. And these are debates which echo the British race relations agenda since the 1970s and the 1980s. And this is an example of where people would be dispersed to in Glasgow. Dispersal policy is one part of a formally segregated welfare support system, the National Asylum Support System, which removed asylum seekers entirely from mainstream welfare services. Support for people in the asylum system amounts to approximately £37.75 per week per person, an amount that has only increased in pennies since 2000. This support is widely recognised as a level that leads to people experiencing poverty. Someone refused asylum, considered appeals rights exhausted, may be supported with around £35.39 on a prepayment card for food, clothing and toiletries. When it was first implemented, local authorities could opt in to become dispersal areas, and so it's an accommodation-led policy driven by availability of housing, not by social needs. So houses like these have been lying with spaces lying vacant. However, housing has generally been of poor quality standard. And dispersal is not a fixed process. It's purposefully designed to disrupt over and over again. So it's not just the packing of belongings, but the changing of schools and moving on to wherever housing is available. Oftentimes with areas with no history of refugee dispersal and few so-called integration services. Since 2001, around 10% of overall UK asylum applicants have been dispersed to Glasgow, and it now has among its population the vast majority of the 20,000 people in Scotland once identified as refugees. An important myth surrounding asylum migration has been that asylum seekers are really economic migrants in disguise, chasing economic betterment by accessing provisions of the British welfare state. But in relation to welfare support, asylum seekers are excluded from the labour market and cannot claim mainstream benefits. And in the UK, people have been supported via vouchers, cash then vouchers reintroduced for hard case support, and then the Azure prepayment card, and now the Aspen card, which itself has been criticised because it allows the Home Office to monitor card usage data. And in fact, the Home Office has explicitly said they will analyse card usage data, meaning that where people spend their money and how they spend may at a later stage be used against them. So we have a perfect storm of compulsory dispersal, no choice housing, the withdrawal of the right to work and of support in cases of people refused claims, prolonged processing times, in many cases taking many years, and the use of destitution and detention as key tools of deterrence. This produces a dehumanising context designed to force people into destitution, leave them with no access to social security benefits, no right to work to support themselves, forced into poverty for an indeterminate period of time, and no entitlement even to make use of statutory homelessness services. This present context of reception, often framed as a hostile environment, has gone further to exclude asylum seekers over any other category of migrant. So, what is interesting about Glasgow is that in many cases we are able to trace and connect current migrant solidarity with the much wider and longer history of everyday social struggles and crises that have shaped the city. There are many examples of powerful DIY activism in response to the unjust and punitive treatment of people in the asylum process. These include the famous Glasgow Girls campaign at Drumchapel High School, a dispersal neighbourhood, where teenage schoolgirls campaigned against the Home Office on behalf of their disappearing fellow students who were being removed in dawn raids and returned either through processes of detention and then deportation. And in this clip we can hear Emma and Amal talking about this campaign. The Glasgow campaign to welcome refugees that emerged in 2001 has been very vocal in fighting for an improved quality of life for asylum seekers and refugees, with the backing of various trade unions and politicians from several parties, as well as huge numbers of local people. The Unity Centre, based minutes from the UK Home Office's main reporting centre in Glasgow, and this is where asylum seekers are expected to report either daily, weekly or monthly, gives practical support and solidarity to asylum seekers and other migrants in Scotland. Their collective action has resulted in substantial changes to the treatment of asylum seekers in Scotland, and also contributes forcefully to public debate in Scotland being less hostile. Destitution is a growing crisis, and although figures are hard to confirm, organisations like the Glasgow Night Shelter for Destitute Asylum Seekers provides emergency overnight accommodation for destitute people, non-EU migrants and other people with no recourse to public funds who are blocked from accessing homeless services due to their various situations. The night shelter operates from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m, 365 nights a year, providing a hot evening meal and breakfast. People using this as service are very much at the sharp end of the government's hostile environment. And in this clip, you can hear Patrick and other guests talking about how they use the night shelter. Other forms of community organisation have also emerged since 2000 and the implementation of dispersal. Maryhill Integration Network and Govan Community Project are two examples of long-standing grassroots organisations that have evolved over time, providing a combination of more formalised casework, social activities and advocacy and campaigning work. This short clip talks about Maryhill Integration Network's 2019 Right to Work campaign, arguing for a lifting of the ban on asylum seekers being able to work while they wait for their claim to be processed. And this short clip of Govan Community Project talks about the kinds of work they do, the kind of social services they provide and community activities, as well as the advocacy work that they run in parallel. For long-standing groups like Govan Community Project and like Maryhill Integration Project, helping migrants, much of their work has remained unchanged since 2000. The spectacle of the 2015 migration crisis led to a reactivation of some practices, offering new opportunities for people in those communities and for organisations collectively and individually, as well as for organisations working with wider local Scottish communities to rethink and reshape forms of solidarity. An excellent example of this is the campaigning work of Living Rent, a tenants' rights association around the Serco lock changes practice. Serco is one of the privatised housing providers for people in the asylum process, and they implemented a practice of forcibly removing people from houses when they were considered to be at the end of their asylum claim, and so a practice of lock changes. And this clip talks through some of that practice, and it was very much presented drawing on this history of place and solidarity in Glasgow when Serco were told, "You've picked the wrong city in Glasgow." So we can see here resistance and migrant solidarity has been extended to include injustices to all, migrants and Scottish citizens, in its focus on fighting structural inequalities with solidarity and common cause as a call for transformative action. The case of Glasgow points to, we think, practices of resistance and solidarity that are shaped by and connected to people, memory, time and place. In Glasgow, solidarity as a practice is part of the cityscape and, like crisis, is often framed not as episodic but endemic, central to the city's identity. Given Glasgow's status as a top dispersal city in the UK, exploring the Glasgow context provides, we think, some opportunities for thinking through how we might reconnect a practice of resistance and solidarity at a local level across different dimensions of immigration, so people in the asylum process, people who are quota refugees being resettled in the city, and support for people translocally in other places across the world. What resistance and solidarity mean and how they are enacted is as varied as the actors who evoke it. And in a city like Glasgow, history and place as a combined analytical lens offer, we think, particular insights. And we'd like to end this case study with these questions for reflection. These questions that ask us to bring together time and space to help us understand how history and memory are put to work in the present. And then to reflect on what kinds of actions and allegiances and alliances may be activated or reactivated to emerge in new forms.